there are usually two or more groups making judgments, and one's got a wider boundary judgment of what belongs or what focus ought to be or what counts than the other. And so you get a conflict, contest between boundary judgments, one wider and one narrow, and whatever's caught in that, whether it's people or whether it's issues, then becomes the focus for a lot of conflict.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Gerald Midgley as we take a communication perspective on episodes, boundaries, and marginalization. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. It means seeing ourselves as active participants with choices about how we show up to each other. It is paying attention to patterns, context, stories, and relationships to better understand how meaning gets made. It is embodying curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to co-create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the idea is that by looking at communication instead of through it, in this conversation and in all that we do, we expand our collective imagination through both storytelling and story hearing, revealing new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Gerald Midgley. Gerald is an emeritus professor in the Centre for Systems Studies at the University of Hull, UK, with hundreds of publications on systems thinking. He has countless other accolades, but I'm going to pause here and let him introduce himself to you in just a moment. Something I would have you keep your mind on as you join us in this conversation is taking a step toward releasing yourself from any kind of oversimplistic this or that, either or narrative. In this conversation, Gerald and I are seeing what layers of meaning we can add to the conversation of systems and of communication. And some common ground we hit is a similar approach to ideas like moral forces or shoulds, boundaries, and stories. Often we're tempted to relate in an all or nothing kind of way to these things. But we hope that you'll step into imagining a different story and a different relationship with us, one that has a little bit more complexity. So with that in mind, let's begin the conversation with Gerald. Hi, Gerald. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me here. This is a great experience.
I'm really, really looking forward to the kind of conversation we're going to have. As you know, I like to start with the question of how are we arriving? I'm always curious about how people understand that question. I've been told it's a very American question. I don't really know what that means, but I'll accept it as, part of maybe bias I have. But I found it to be very helpful. So I still like it, even if that's maybe a critique of it. I'll start and give you a moment to think about how you're arriving.
Sure.
Honestly, this is the question that I think about the most ahead of time before these podcasts happen. I don't have a huge plan for the rest of the conversation, but I always like to know and reflect on what I'm arriving with the day before, the morning before the podcast recording. And for me, one thing that's front of mind is that in the conversations you and I have had, just via email even, to get this podcast coordinated, you paid me one of the greatest compliments I've received about my podcast, which is that, you're close friends and colleagues with Rachel Lilly, and you said some very kind words about the conversation I had with her in terms of, you've heard her say this content, maybe some of these same ideas in a lot of different ways, but that you were complimenting me on what I was able to bring out of her. And that meant so much to me because that's exactly what I'm trying to do and hoping to do by framing these conversations with the communication perspective and saying that even if you're intimately familiar with these ideas, even if you've heard this person speak a million times, if you've read all of their writing, I'm hoping that we're going to pull something new out of this, that we're going to add a layer of additional value because of the communication perspective that's being used. And I fully believe that. That's my soapbox, the hill I'll die on. It is so transformative to have that communication perspective, to start looking at this thing, to start paying attention to this thing that is maybe largely invisible for a lot of people. So that's kind of front of mind for me. So thank you for that compliment you paid me and the confidence it's, given me continuing forward. And I think that it particularly applies to this conversation with you, maybe even more so than others, because I know that you are someone who is looked to for answers, commentary, thoughts in the world of systems thinking. That you have, written hundreds of things. You spoke, I got to see you speak at the Relating Systems Thinking and Design conference this past year. And I could see people in the audience being like starstruck by seeing you there, saying, oh, I referenced Midgley et al. In my research, and now here I am speaking with Midgley. And I was thinking, oh, you mean Gerald right over here? Gerald, who I know. And so that gave me some additional context to see how the community of systems thinkers relates to you. So that being said, the way I'm arriving to this conversation is with a hope to, again, meet that challenge, which feels like a little bit of an extra challenge with you to add something to what you've already offered the world. So I'm excited to have this platform because I think a podcast is really special for being conversational. My hope is it's a little more relaxed than if you were, giving a presentation at a conference, a little less formal than if you were writing a paper. And again, I'm bringing the communication perspective here. So I'm really excited to see what new layers we can, dig down into, add, unpack in this conversation today. So that's a lot, but that is what is front of mind for me as I go into this conversation with you. And yeah, I've had a lot of great conversations with systems thinkers. So it is a little bit of always the challenge of what else can we say? And I think there is always more to say. So I hope that doesn't present too big of a challenge for us today. So, Gerald, how are you arriving today?
How am I arriving? I'm bringing multiple things in at once, I think. What you've just said gives me a warm feeling of, that's kind of nice reciprocal kind of feeling. I had a really frustrating morning. I just wasted £160 on train tickets because the software corrupted
Oh,
my order of the tickets,
oh,
and then I couldn't get the money back. So I was really
devastating.
frustrated,
Yes,
and then dealing with AI bots on the way
not
to try
fun.
to get the money back, which I couldn't. So I got that, and I did a little bit of meditation just before this because which
Yeah.
settled me and created a bit of a symbolic break, if you like, between um, that experience and this one. I'm bringing in, I guess, the feeling that I often get when I'm in a situation where I'm going to be visible and it could be perceived I'm as acting in an authority position
Mm-hmm.
because I'm both feeling the need to own that and also to share that with others. But
Yeah,
also, I've always been deeply uncomfortable with it
sure.
because, and this comes from absolutely hating the whole kind of relationship between teachers and students at
Mm-hmm.
school. Huge amount of fear at school. I had some genuinely abusive teachers,
Mm.
and I won't go into details, but we're talking about serious abuse
Yeah,
and not just a bit of yelling.
yeah.
And I've resisted doing teaching for years because I don't want to be in that situation. So there's always been this kind of double tension that I'm feeling when I'm going up to speak. There's the excitement of wanting to contribute and wanting to engage with other people, but the kind of fear of being visible
Mm-hmm.
and the fear of doing to other people what was done to me
Mm.
that is just underlying a lot. So I was handling that before I came in here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I think that experiences may be familiar to a lot of people that if they were really asked in different situations, how are they arriving? Their list would be long. Like we bring a lot with us into these conversations. And I think hearing you speak, the way you spoke, what you just shared, it has me going back to this thought that it's not just the way that we speak, it's the way that we've learned to listen that is worth like revisiting. And I think that's part of what adds maybe to the fear or the discomfort with like a teacher student dynamic is that we're taught to listen in a way that says, if that person's standing at the front of the room and I'm sitting, what they are saying is true, real, fact, more valid than what I have to say. There's a kind of value judgment or like hierarchy that gets added in there. And so, again, because I see communication as more than just what's being said, like listening is communicating. I'm curious about, as a speaker or as a listener, how do you change that for yourself? How do you invite other people to change that for themselves, of like the way that they listen? So it would take the pressure off you as the teacher, quote unquote, for example, for other people to say, I'm so excited to hear what Gerald has to say. And I'm excited for what it makes me think. And I want to contribute to the conversation. And I think that's how I think about these conversations too, that it is easy for me also to say, whoa, the guest on my podcast is so accomplished. I really want to like defer and just like learn from you. But that doesn't, I think, lead to such a fun podcast. And so I really changed my mindset to be like, well, what can I contribute to? Because I don't think it's actually helpful for either of us, for me to put myself in this one down position when I could be contributing and asking questions that no one else could ask, or no one else is asking, because I have the perspective I do. You have the perspective you do. We all have the perspective we do. And can we learn to engage with each other in a way that just values each of those perspectives as one of many, rather than the right one or the wrong one? So I'm getting on my soapbox already, but I'm just excited by what you've already shared.
That's good. That's good. It's at the very superficial level, it's kind of moving from a teacher to a facilitator mode, but that really is superficial, I think, because the first time I actually did teaching, I did it on the condition that we could, and my wife Wendy Gregory and myself co-designed this course together. This was back in the early 90s, where we said there's not going to be any preset curriculum with the lecturers determining there's going to be broad topic areas, but the lecturers are there to facilitate the individual learning of students and the collective sharing of that learning, so that people can get feedback from peers as much as from us as lecturers. So in a sense, it's moving to a facilitator role, but there's something about being a facilitator that none of your communications in that context are ever neutral, because they're always they're coming from your past experience. Any question that you ask is going to move things in one direction to another. Your own understanding of the situation is bounded. You won't see half of what's going on. And, you reduce the complexity. It's guided by your purposes in relation to the other's purposes. So there's so much going on that you need to have that self-reflective capability in the moment, at the same time as actually having the conversation. And of course, you don't see an awful lot, and you realize a lot in retrospect, but that's fine. I think the key is not to believe, if once you become a facilitator, that facilitation is ever anything other than guided by your own past experience and how you're then hearing the other person. And so it's also then by making yourself accountable, because you can then give the other person the opportunity to say, no, wait a minute. That's not what I meant, or I wanted to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I love that. And I think something I hope we can talk about more today is that, like, you're describing this really beautiful practice of like paying attention deeply, being very mindful, and making, choices in terms of how you're showing up. And that's definitely easier said than done. So I'm curious to get into like how maybe you've embodied that, how you've seen other people come to embody that. But before we get there, I wonder what else, as you're talking about, we're kind of building on this. How are you arriving? Like, what are the stories we're bringing with us? I wonder what else you would say by means of introducing yourself, if there's other stories that come to mind for you as you think about, your relationship to systems thinking, the work that you do, the work that excites you. Are there other stories that you'd like to share, or things that, you want us to know about you that give us that additional context to help, better understand you as we have, this hour together today?
Yeah. So I'll share a superficial story, but then a deeper one,
Great.
because I think that's quite useful. So the more superficial one is that I did an undergraduate degree in psychology, and I was really frustrated with the boundaries of psychology and
Mm-hmm.
the focus at purely an individual level, and very often biochemistry of the brain and that kind of stuff. It just really frustrated me. And we had a semester of lectures on psychopathy, and it was all about chemical theories of the brain,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't really put somebody who's labeled a psychopath into context.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 minutes from the end of the very last lecture after a whole semester, this lecturer suddenly said, I've got a duty to tell you that there are just as many theories about how psychopathy is a social construction and not an individual one.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to hear that, do you? And all of these students went, no, we don't want to hear that. I thought, that's just outrageous. That is outrageous.
Of course we
That,
want to hear it.
your curiosity is
Yeah.
closed off, and
Yeah. Wow.
telling us that, and I just could not accept the idea of
Yes.
disciplinary boundaries. So my starting point, leaving university, was needing to go beyond what I've learned. And I mean, I got into systems thinking. I found out about systems thinking because I wanted to do a PhD and assumed it would have to be in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody had recommended City University's psychology department, and I rang City University, and the switchboard just put me through to the wrong department. They put me through to the systems science department, which
Wow.
existed then. It
Yes.
doesn't exist any longer.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it was about 15 minutes into talking with this guy before we realized that I'd been put through to the wrong department. And he said, come and see me anyway.
Oh,
and
wow. What a
and then
story.
I ended up doing an MPhil and PhD in systems.
There you go.
But it answered that question for me, because
Mm-hmm.
with systems, it's not about this is the field of ideas that are relevant. It's about we see things in terms of systems, which means we define and redefine systems on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you can stray into any territory in principle. Systems um, have ecological, social, individual, biological components,
Mm-hmm.
technological, all sorts. So in principle, you explore the boundaries that could be relevant,
Mm-hmm.
and don't let those get determined by some pre-given discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the superficial story. The deeper one is more to do with what I've learned over the years about my own motivations for where I've gone in my own systems thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which have just deepened. My understanding of that has just deepened in several waves over the years, because I started out with this burning desire
Mm-hmm.
to do good in
Mm-hmm.
inverted commas, and I had some really quite um, damaging splits in what I considered to be good and not
Mm.
good.
Yeah.
So we're talking about maybe in my 20s. So community development was good. I worked in mental health for a while. That was
Mm-hmm.
good. Business is bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These kinds of simple dichotomies
Sure.
where you're
Sure.
kind of simplifying the world,
Yeah.
and of course you don't see all the complexity in the things that you're just labeling and
Right.
dismissing. And a lot of that was to do with dealing with marginalization. So I had this great kind of mission that anything I do is to be dealing with marginalization in communities, but not just marginalization of people either, but also issues like
Mm.
environmental issues, for example. Back then, it was just considered a weird tree hugging thing to be
Right.
talking
Right.
about climate change.
Yes. Yeah.
In the 1980s, only a minority of people really understood those sorts of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that. And when I think about where that comes from, as a small child, I was completely overwhelmed by by being with other children. It was like a cacophony being in the playground.
Mm-hmm.
and I was just unable to communicate at all without rehearsing. Now, can you imagine what it's like to be in a playground, not
Mhm.
even being able to say something to a kid who's kind of poking you in the face and wanting something from you?
Yeah.
And it was an overwhelming, continuous fear. And
Mhm.
when you're in that situation, people talk about bullying, and they assume when you're talking about bullying that it's the aggressive child who's hurting other children.
Mhm.
That's not your experience. If you're in that situation of being unable to communicate spontaneously, bullying is the 29 other children in the class who are so different to you
Mhm.
that you're basically feeling completely marginalized in that situation.
Mhm.
And there was a kind of a deep injustice to it.
Yeah.
So it's a personal experience of fear combined with that injustice. So that's basically where it comes from. I only realized that doing that kind of self-reflective work much later,
Mhm.
that's why it was so important to me. But having said that, you can actually see marginalization dynamics everywhere,
Mhm.
simply because it's impossible for us to have anything other than a bounded understanding. We
Yeah.
can reflect on and change our boundaries, but even when we change our boundaries, we never transcend boundaries. We find a new boundary. You can't have meaning without boundaries.
Mhm.
And because of that, you see situations where people maybe um, unintentionally leave out a particular issue or a
Mhm. Mhm.
particular stakeholder group or whatever. And it starts to create a social dynamic of marginalization where then people begin to justify the boundaries that they've already made.
Mhm.
They start to say, this is what should happen based on my narrow boundary, which means
Mhm.
that everybody who thinks differently is suddenly profane. And conversely, we believe in this wider boundary of what needs to happen,
Mhm.
and we see whatever's being marginalized as sacred.
Mhm.
That's the language I kind of drew upon from anthropology to help explain the marginalization. And it is, you do find it everywhere. So it's one of those things. Other systems thinkers have said to me, oh, but you will end up just seeing everything as marginalization and there's lots else. Well, of
Mhm.
course, there's lots else.
Mhm. Mhm.
But if you don't at least take the possibility that there's marginalization there when you start, then your starting point could be such a narrow boundary that you don't see the damage that you're doing.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I always say, well, explore it. If it isn't there, that's great. Let's then move on to something else. Um, so so for me, it's really important, and it's really important not as a sociological theory.
Mhm.
So I'm quite aware that the language I've developed, and I have been critiqued for this, for not just going with the language of othering and belonging, and what I've produced is more complex than that. But it's more complex for a reason. That othering and belonging is the dynamic that's underlying a lot of the marginalization.
Mhm.
But there's a lot more going on than that. There's the
Yeah.
boundaries, there's the conflict, there's the kind of attribution of profanity
Mhm.
to others. There's the social rituals that can actually close down and concretize the marginalization, or it can open it up and
Mhm.
provide a counter. And you get marginalization at local levels that can be sometimes easily shifted, like in a
Mhm.
friendship group. You can sometimes just see it shifting through the
Mhm.
dynamics of the way people talk,
Yeah.
and it can be absolutely embedded in society in ways that it's very, very difficult to counter. You can maybe counter it in a local situation and do your best, but changing it in the wider society is much more difficult. So something like unemployment is an example I use for that. The unemployed are marginalized because they're neither fully included nor fully excluded. So our whole economics is based on the idea of organizations looking after their own employees.
Mhm.
So um, so unemployed people don't fit that. They're outside that, but they're within the
Mhm.
boundaries of the wider society and kind of the liberal ideal of in principle we're all equal,
Hmm.
means that we have a social duty to also include them. So they're not both, they're included in one sense, excluded in the other. And that
Hmm.
is always a recipe for marginalization.
Hmm.
Unless we were to fundamentally change the way our economy works, that isn't going to change.
Hmm.
We can deal with the effects in local situations, and we can mitigate those. We can
Uh-huh.
change things locally. It's very hard to change that dynamic in the whole of society.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the being taken back to the last podcast conversation I had was actually with Christian Barron, who I believe you wrote the foreword for his book that's about to come out.
Yeah, yeah,
And we
yeah.
spoke about complexity and simplicity because I was referencing, that the CMM theory is incredibly complex because I think it has to be, and I can understand the tendency for us to want to simplify things to make them more accessible or easily understood. But I think that that's a disservice to ourselves. And what we need is to learn the tools to navigate complexity rather than to just look away when we're met with, look away as a metaphor when we're met with complexity because it feels too complex, because it feels unnavigable to us. And so I like what you're saying is, yes, it's belonging and othering, but what else can be said about what's going on here that is helpful for naming? Because that's so important, to name what's happening, because that empowers people to even be able to describe what's going on for them. And that's a social thing and a relational thing as well, to be able to hear someone else describe. I imagine there's people who, have just heard the story you've told about what being young was like for you and thought, oh, that was my experience too, but maybe I've never have described it that way, or that's a new way of, hearing that described. So I appreciate the, function almost of stories for helping us to expand our imagination of what is possible, not just in terms of what can happen, but how it can be described or how it can be thought about or related to. And I think that helps us navigate the complexity of things. The other two stories that are coming to mind, just as context for the next question I want to ask, is that if you'll remember in the conversation I had with Rachel, we had just been talking about, kind of assumptions and expectations and meaning making. And then I think I went on to share kind of maybe longer story. And she said, I don't know what you just said. Like she responded to what I had shared with like confusion. And that panicked me so much because it felt like a communication failure because we're indoctrinated into this idea that communication should be like quick and flawless and meaning should pass, smoothly from one to the other. So it felt like a failure on my part for a moment. And then I was like, let me step out, let me step back from that. And like asking a clarifying question is a beautiful thing and an important thing because we are making assumptions about what people mean when they say something. And a lot of times we're close enough that we can function at least, but sometimes we're
Yeah.
not. And there is, again, it's like we have the tool of asking, what do you mean when you said that? Or I'm not sure. Or this is what I heard. Is that what you said? Like there are ways to put that into language. I think people are like afraid to use because maybe like what I was feeling, it feels like a communication failure or a personal failure that I should have understood what was just said. And I have no idea what was just said. It feels too risky
Yeah.
and vulnerable to ask that clarifying question. So I'm just going to stay silent. I think that's a motivating force for a lot of people, probably. So I have that story in mind. The other is that I recently was part of a presentation about CMM for this group through Fielding Graduate University, which is a place in the United States where a lot of people who use CMM have studied at or teach at. So I knew that it was a very, CMM steeped community. The co-facilitators and I of this presentation were expecting more students, more people who were brand new to CMM to be on this call, but we ended up with more like faculty and alumni who knew CMM and were just, like kind of there to support us or excited to support us. And so I felt a little panicked about, am I just saying something to them that they already know? Because, I have the context that, oh, you're already familiar with CMM, then the whole thing. And then we got to the end and we kind of just like, gave the presentation anyway. I still like put things in my own words and trusted that, that was valuable. And someone who, I was introduced to in that moment is like, oh, I've known CMM from the beginning, asked such what felt to me a simple question, an important question about like, well, what does that look like in practice? And it just hit me in the face of like, yeah, you cannot take for granted that everybody knows everything or that everything means the same thing to us. And so it was just a really great reminder of like all of our talking about the things we think we know is incredibly
Mm,
value, and there is always more to learn and be said and think differently about. So that was like, I'm going to really hold that experience close with me because I am younger and I work with a lot of people who have used this theory for like, you know, eat, sleep, breathe, CMM. And so I can feel,
mm,
again, like I talked about earlier in the podcast, that like deferential position of like, well, you know more than I do. But I have my own relationship to the theory, and so I'm working on like seeing the value in that as well. So all of that is
mm.
context for me wanting to ask you, can you say more about what you mean by boundaries and marginalization? Because I have an assumption that many people listening who maybe clicked on this episode because your name is on it have heard or read something you've talked about in terms of boundaries and marginalization. But I don't want to fall into the trap of that assumption and glaze over it. So I'd love to hear in your own words, again, in this maybe less formal setting of a podcast, what do
Sure.
you mean when you say boundaries? What do you mean when you say marginalization?
Yeah, just before I get to that,
I know I said a lot just
a
there.
little, no, a little story
Yeah, please.
about that kind of illustrates that not, sometimes even the simple words we might
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
understand very differently. When my wife and I first moved in together, we had
mm-hmm.
a fireplace that we didn't like, and we wanted to replace it, and neither of us could quite get why we both felt that the other one wasn't understanding what we were saying we were
Uh-huh.
wanting. And the conversation, we must have revisited it about, well, numerous times over about
Sure.
3 months. And suddenly we realized that we had a completely different understanding of what the fireplace was. That
Exactly.
I
Yes.
wanted quite a small hole with a surround, and she wanted this great wide open thing. And no
Yeah.
wonder we weren't
Yeah.
communicating properly.
Yes, that's what happens. That is exactly what happens. Just yesterday, my partner and I, he was like, I thought you said this yesterday. I said, I didn't say that. He said, well, this is why I've never said that. And we just kind of like shrugged it
Yeah,
off and like moved on. Like we didn't get hung up on
yeah,
like, well, you were wrong or
yeah,
you weren't listening. It was just like, that happens. You just talk past each other and you think you are understanding each other and you're just not. And that's okay because that
yeah.
happens in communication.
Yeah, and just to validate what you were saying about CMM, so I've worked with a community of people that call themselves critical systems thinkers,
Hmm.
and with any kind of approach, there's always certain people who see themselves as the founders of a particular approach,
Hmm.
and people often see them and they see themselves as having the right to define what the thing
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
And I realized, being right at the heart of this community, that what critical systems thinking meant for every single person involved was actually a little bit different. And
Absolutely.
that what you could do, you could hop up a meta level and say, okay, there are these themes. There's critical awareness, self-awareness. There's mixing methods. You could, there's aiming for improvement, but problematizing what improvement means so that you're exploring it. They're
Hmm.
those sorts of principles that everybody would be interested in. But what they mean to people
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
quite different.
Yep.
So there's always value, and you don't form a thriving community of people
Yeah,
by
right.
trying to get everybody thinking the same.
Hmm.
You have certain elements that are in common that allow that people can start orientating their communications around.
Yeah.
But the difference is really important if you're actually going to thrive.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's
Anyway, boundaries.
I know I asked you a question, but yeah, I think that's one of
Yeah,
the tools of navigating complexity, I think, is like in
yeah,
communication we would call it pluralistic truths, little t
yeah,
truths, you know, that my story and your story can and do, whether we like it or not, coexist.
yeah.
And I think that that's one of those, like, again, taken for granted tools that sometimes hearing another person's story that is maybe different from ours feels like a threat to our story, our little t truth.
Mhm.
that feels like a capital T truth. Usually, I think a lot of times
Hmm.
it's like you hold on to it as like, well, this is what's true for me, so it must be what's true for you. And if people feel like under threat, under duress, then that they're not going to be able to be curious and relational and improvisational, all these really beautiful things that like create these
Mm.
relationships. So I think that's a real skill to develop for people to know their story to be one of many, to be comfortable with that, to be confident in that. Yeah, there's probably so much more to say, but yeah, I want to hear about boundaries
Yeah.
and marginalization. Hey, it's Abbie here, taking a pause in this conversation to invite you to reflect with me about how this episode is hitting you so far. If you're wanting to learn more about the coordinated management of meaning theory that I reference in this conversation, I'd recommend checking out the CMM Institute Substack for additional educational resources. If you're loving what you're hearing and are curious to learn more about CMM in different contexts, use the link in the show notes to follow the CMM Institute event page, where you can stay up to date with our monthly webinars hosted by yours truly. These events are an opportunity to gather with our community and explore CMM in different ways. And if you're looking to be even more connected, you can peruse our other CMM Institute initiatives, like our free social emotional learning resources, Cosmo Activities, which feature ways to engage all ages in conversations about building better social worlds. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes. As we turn toward the second half of this episode, I invite you to reconnect with your body and your environment. As the music plays to take us back to the conversation, take a breath, sink into your body wherever you are, take in your surroundings, and settle in for some more stories. Let's get back into it.
Okay. I mean, so let me just say, give a brief sketch of what a system is, and of course,
Yes,
this is just
perfect.
going to be a simplification. But a system is a number of interrelated elements that cohere together, and you can define a boundary. So you can say what's inside and outside the system, but
Mm-hmm.
boundaries are not necessarily consensual because different people can see what's
Right.
inside, different things inside and outside, and systems are always seen from a perspective. Now, from there, you've got various concepts that you can abstract out of there. You've got interrelationships, you've got perspectives, you've got boundaries, you've got the notion of emergence, because a system fundamentally has emergent properties that can only
Mm-hmm.
be understood in terms of the whole and not
Yeah,
by
right.
any of the individual parts. So, I mean, your human body, your thinking actually doesn't make sense just as a brain activity
Mm-hmm.
because your nervous system as a whole.
Yeah, great point.
So boundary is one of those concepts. Now you can abstract then that notion of boundary, which means it becomes a thinking skill then to explore where boundaries might be
Yep.
in any situation. And you've got the possibility of including and excluding different voices. So that's the kind of issue of who are we making visible, whose voices are we marginalizing. That's those kinds of issues, because you can't include everybody in the world and
Mm-hmm.
future generations
Mm-hmm.
and ancestors as well in every situation. So you're always going to make boundary judgments about whose voices you're hearing. And the other thing is about what issues, what do you see as connected with this, and what
Right.
do you see as
Yeah.
external to it? So, for me, one of the critical systems thinking skills is actually exploring boundaries, not so much setting boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Setting boundaries is a necessary step if you're going to, because boundaries simultaneously enable and constrain something. That's the other
Absolutely. Yeah.
always boundaries enable and constrain. And so there comes a point for action where you have to have that enablement, and you have to
Mm-hmm.
have the constraint of other things in order to make that action
Right.
happen.
Yeah. You're not saying, because I could see maybe a temptation to like add this layer of meaning there.
Yeah,
You're not, boundaries are not a bad thing. They're just a reality. And then we have
they're
choices
inevitable.
about, yeah, they're inevitable. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's not don't have any boundaries. It's, what would you say? Like, be
Oh, it
mindful of
annoys
the
me.
boundary. Sure.
There's a few books actually that talk about that have titles like No Boundaries, and
Sure. Yes.
actually it's not possible. You can
Yeah.
transcend boundaries, but there's always another boundary involved in
Yeah.
that transcendence.
Yeah, that's how people I work with feel about stories, where it's like you need to be really like mindful and careful with your storytelling. But it's not, well, don't tell a story. Like, you just are telling a story. Whatever
Yeah,
you are saying, however you are, interacting, showing up,
yeah,
you're telling a story. And so it's not, be so neutral that you never tell any story, you never affect anyone or influence anyone or
yeah,
add anything to the conversation. It's just, be mindful that you are telling a story and that you
yeah,
have choices and tools about how you carry
yeah,
that, like, introduce that story to others, I guess.
yeah. I mean, it'd be a bit of a distraction. I won't go here there now, but just to signal it, if you want to go there, I would actually start from the point of view that we're incapable of non-intervention.
Ah,
So
yeah.
if you're, so actually, um, the question then is what intervention, what
Yeah.
boundaries? So what are you seeing? What are you not seeing? And
Yeah.
exploring that, because 99% of the time we're taking boundaries for granted.
Yeah.
Our institutions are often designed to make sure that we see some things and not others. And that can be really problematic, especially at
Hmm.
times of change. Because
Absolutely.
so 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 actually exploring different possible boundaries, both of who's involved and what issues matter,
Yeah.
is important. And the thing is that those boundary judgments are always linked to questions about what could or should be done.
Yeah.
So the boundary is about what there is and whose voices there are. And then you've got this question of normative vision, if you like, what could or
Uh-huh.
should be done. And people may have different views. And when you change your perspective on what could or should be done, it brings different things into your vision,
Hmm.
and you change your boundary judgments. Conversely, you can change your boundary judgments and you can see different things that could or should be done. And actually broadening beyond shoulds, because very often when people are in a situation of threat,
Hmm.
especially when it's a really entrenched system of conflict or
Yeah.
marginalization, and people are in that system of threat. I mean, in Rachel Lilly's podcast, I think she talked about the kind of narrowing of perception.
Hmm.
That is what happens. So people fix on boundaries. That's not relevant. Stop bringing up that kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
So it's kind of profane stuff people are bringing up. And also, this is what we should be doing, and people
Hmm.
pursue. The more certainty then you get around the boundaries and what should be done, the more that situation entrenches, and the more there is the temptation just to kind of demonize people who are thinking differently about this, or issues that other people are trying to force on the agenda,
Hmm.
and that you're trying to resist. So my purpose for actually understanding boundaries and the coulds and shoulds that drive those boundary judgments, that interact with those boundary judgments, is all about more plasticity in our thinking and in our dialogue as well, because this is not I'm not taking a kind of naive notion that thinking is just what happens in your head. It also
Yep.
happens in relation between
Yep.
people, as through the kind of discussion we're having now. I mean, I didn't
Yeah.
intend to go into half of the things that you've just led me to. So that it's with others, and it's also an ecological environment. So
Hmm.
that actually participates in our thinking as well,
Yeah.
the feedback processes we have with the world. So it's all thinking, and the thing is, how can you get greater plasticity in that thought, and also
Yes.
still make decisions? So one of the big fears that I get thrown at me when I have this kind of discussion with people, but if I suspend judgment on boundaries, everything will become boundaryless and the whole universe will matter, and I won't be able to make a decision. And that actually, it's a fear, but it doesn't happen.
Mhm.
There's several reasons why it doesn't happen. part of the reason I'm interested in some of the systems methods is they give people processes for exploring boundaries and other things in connections and what have you, but also taking you to a point where people make decisions and they find accommodations with each
Yes.
other. So there are processes, social processes that you can use to both open up and, when necessary, close down. But it's also the way our bodies work, in terms of there is no such thing. So certainly, if you go back to the 1980s, you look at the systems literature from the early 1980s, they talk about how can you improve reason about boundary judgments. And that word reason, it can be a bit misleading if you believe that reason is somehow separate from emotion. And that's certainly
Right,
how it
right.
used to be written about. But it
Yes.
isn't. I mean, the cognitive system is both about thinking and emotion, and the two are so totally connected
Yeah.
that it doesn't even make sense to talk about them separately, which means that there's emotion involved in attachment to those possible shoulds or coulds. There's emotion involved in terms of the boundaries that you're seeing, and you're bringing different emotions into play when you shift the boundaries. So it's a kind of tool to change that opens up new possibilities
Yeah.
for seeing, thinking, feeling, and then interpreting that feeling as emotion. And certainly my experience is that the intervention processes, if it works, if it's really strong, it's quite an emotional process. People have real lows when they're struggling with things, and moments of
Yeah.
euphoria when they make breakthroughs in their understanding. And the flat kind of workshops are usually the ones where people say at the end, well, it was interesting, but not sure.
Yeah.
Much of what I've said about emotion, by the way, I've learned from Rachel Lilly.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. What's coming to mind as you're speaking is I'm seeing more and more like the parallels between, my work with interpersonal communication feels like a big zooming in, because it is interested in the turn by turn, what's happening, what's being said moment to moment. And systems thinking feels so zoomed out. But really, both are both. You can't talk about one without the other, because the system is created in the interpersonal communication, and the interpersonal communication is affected by the system that it's happening within. So I'm seeing all these parallels in the way we talk about things. For example, you talking about boundaries, the kind of communication parallel is we talk about episodes. So the story that comes to mind for me is that the last year I was in college, I had a fight with a good friend who I'd known throughout college. And the way that I was storying it is that our friendship had been a little rocky for some time due to different things. And I felt like I had kept reaching out and kept trying to, kind of resolve things with this friend or find a relationship that worked better for both of us. And then there was finally a day we had kind of like big falling out, like confrontation. We argued. And then I understood that to be, okay, there's not more to do. She's done trying. We're done. And we really didn't speak again. And then I was like, that's what happened. That was my story of what happened. And then later we had a mutual friend who spoke to this person and relayed back to me that the friend that I was no longer friends with was surprised that I didn't reach out after that big fight, because she thought that was the start of more conversations.
Wow.
And that like blew my mind, because I was like, what? How does she see it that way? But again,
Yes.
neither of us are right or wrong. It's just saying, it's where does the episode start? Where does it end? I'm saying, well, this started months ago. And the end of the episode is here. She's saying, I thought this was the start, seeing it in two different ways. And so that's a real testament to like, you cannot take for granted that people are storying things the same way. It's as simple as like you're arguing with your partner or your parent or your child, and they say, well, you always do this. Maybe they're bringing years of frustrations into a conversation when you think you're just arguing about the one thing that happened yesterday, but they're really arguing about the whole relationship. And so that's a really interesting conversation again of like, where are we bounding differently, communicatively, relationally, and systemically? So I've really appreciated everything you said, because that really kind of like brought that to the front for me. And I feel like we're just getting started, but we're actually already towards the end of our conversation. So this
Wow, no.
crazy. I know,
Um,
I know. I feel like I talk forever, but I do want to hear maybe a little more briefly, sorry about the time constraint, but I do want to still hear your, simplest words, or your favorite words, at least. I won't give you the constraint of simple, but a little more about marginalization, since we just, got to talk about boundaries as well.
Yeah, there is something else there though about because what you're talking about in my language
Mm-hmm.
is time boundaries.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, she thought that was the start. You thought it was the end
Mm-hmm.
of it, and I want to give credit to Tony Hodgson here. So Tony Hodgson um, was a scenarios consultant
Mm-hmm.
for a lifetime. And then he did his PhD with me when he was 80 years old. And
Wow.
he did his PhD on the fact that time boundaries have been often neglected in systems thinking. We see
Ah, yes.
boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, but very
Mm-hmm.
little about time. And yet, when you're doing futures work, of course, time boundaries are really important.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, so I would recommend anybody listening to this get uh, hold of his book, Systems Thinking for a Turbulent World,
Mm.
um, which is about that, and it's about the phenomenology of perception as well, the experience of
Mm-hmm.
time, and not just time as some kind of external measurement that's linear,
Mm-hmm.
but our
Mm-hmm.
experience of time that includes the meaning making that is behind
Yep.
our decisions on those time boundaries. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, marginalization.
Marginalization.
I mean, I've said a little bit already
Mm-hmm.
about what it is that there are usually two or more groups
Yeah.
making judgments about and one's got a wider boundary judgment
Mm-hmm.
of what belongs or what focus ought to
Yeah.
be or what counts than the other, and
Mm-hmm.
so you get it's a conflict contest between boundary judgments, one wider and one narrow, and whatever's caught in that, whether it's people or whether it's issues, then becomes the focus for a lot of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and there's never a consensus on the status of people and issues that are being marginalized. It's always
Yeah.
contested.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then institutions come along, and they tend to concretize, make one of those views dominant over the
Mm-hmm.
other. So I mentioned unemployment earlier. I was unemployed for 3 years when I first graduated, because it was the early 1980s when there was a recession on,
Mm-hmm.
and and that's an institutional ritual. You sign on a register saying you're available for work, and it's an exercise in ritual humiliation,
Mm.
because you're being told that the idea that you're profane is dominant over
Mm.
any possibility that you have agency
Right. Right.
that so, I mean, I actually tried to turn it around when I was unemployed. I stood outside a labour exchange, um, and I was giving out leaflets. I must have signed up about 60 unemployed people to a political party that I was a
Mm.
member of at the time, and all I was doing really was just fulfilling another part in the system, because the institutions were saying unemployed people were profane.
Right.
I was saying they're sacred. We can harness their energy and we can turn it into something
Mm-hmm.
positive. Actually, both are just attributions of the marginalization.
Right.
But knowing that gives you all sorts of opportunities
Yep.
to do things differently in situations. So, for example, if I was with Alan Boyd and Mandy Brown, two ex colleagues of mine, we did a project on designing new services for homeless children living on the streets, and because we were aware that children on the streets are doubly marginalized. They're Because they're under 16, they're seen as less rational
Yep. Right.
than adults, and that's an issue. And also because in order to survive on the streets for any more than a couple of days, you're going to have to get into some kind of uh, behavior like shoplifting,
Mm-hmm.
prostitution, drug dealing, whatever. And so they're marginalized on that basis. So we started the project by saying, well, how do we counter this? We went out on the streets at night for 3 months and to talk to young people. And so we got their voices before anything that we were going to do with adults. And it's practical steps like that, understanding the marginalization,
Mm-hmm.
allows you to make those kinds of choices. And it's what that was a lovely project, because it was one of those ones where we were there to help design services, but we also had a chaperone, because from one of the charities, it was a national charity that was working with us, and they do street work, and they basically put up soup kitchens in the streets, and they wait for children to come to them, and when the children come to them, but it can take months for a child to pluck up courage and come to them.
Mm-hmm.
And what they saw is that when we were finding the children ourselves and asking them to talk with us, the children wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to be heard.
Yeah.
There wasn't one child who said, "No, I want to stay away from
Mm-hmm.
this."
Mm-hmm.
And they realized that their sit back and wait policy was actually leaving children exposed to
Yes.
danger on the streets for
Yes.
far longer than they needed to. And it literally took them 2 weeks without even telling us they were doing this. We only found out later. They took that experience and they said they got national policy changed
Wow.
around that for that charity. So your interventions actually can have consequences that
Mm-hmm.
you don't anticipate, which is one of the
Absolutely.
beautiful things about it.
Yes, that's such a great story to help understand the marginalizations and the boundaries of it all. And again, brings up so many parallels for me when you talk about, there's no such thing as non-intervention. I say there's no such thing as
Mm,
not communicating. You might not be saying words, but you're still communicating.
yeah,
Like your actions communicate things, and where you spend your money communicate. It's like there's all
yeah,
kinds of ways to communicate. And the other thing that feels important that I want to pull out here before we wrap up is, you've referenced like should a couple times, and we would call that moral forces or logical forces. It's also been called. And it is that
right,
like drive that makes you feel like you have to or must or should do something. And
yeah,
again, it's not for me, I know this has been my own experience of that. I would hear that and be like, oh, right, well, that's a bad thing because you shouldn't feel like you have to do something. But again, that's not really it. There's more complexity and layers of meaning here, that it's just an
yeah,
acknowledgement that this is a dynamic that is happening. So then the important piece becomes about choice. And I think that is just, for me, that's the heart of all of the purpose of all the tools I hope to offer people by talking about communication, talking about coordinated management of meaning, is this reminder, affirmation again and again and again, that you have choices in terms of, not just what you say or how you act, but how you make meaning of a situation, how you understand a situation. And that's not to say if you're mad about a situation, just decide not to be. I'm not trying to simplify it in that way, but specifically thinking about shoulds, thinking about moral forces, I find that the most generative or most constructive way to relate to that reality is to acknowledge I am an individual in a socially constructed world influenced by that social world. There are dynamics at play, there are stories at play that I've internalized that lead me to act in certain ways, to think in certain ways. I want to pay close attention to those. Again, that deep challenge of look at the thing you haven't been looking at, pay attention to the thing you haven't paid attention to, make visible the thing that's invisible. It is hard. It's not, super easy step one. But that is, I think, that step of paying attention, seeing, what's happening, and then remembering that you, just because that is maybe a story or a reality in your social world, that does not mean it is, again, the capital T truth or the way things have to be. And so for me, it's about, I think with all of what you're saying, with all of what, I'm trying to teach, it's about saying, see what's happening and then make the choice for yourself. Like, I think an example that comes to mind is talking about like, you know, for example, like stay-at-home moms is something that there's some feminists that would be like, being a stay-at-home mom is innately not feminist, not a good decision to make, what, for whatever reasons they would say. But I think the complexity that I would, want to add to that is like, well, I'm not here to dictate what anyone else can or cannot or should not do. But what I find important is that, how did you get there? Was it, well, I stayed at home and my husband went to work and I looked after our children and I did all this unpaid labor because that's how it is? Or did we decide together, make a choice that it makes sense for me to stay home? I would like to stay home and you will make us money because you like your job, or your job makes a lot of money, or this is something we can financially afford right now, which it's a luxury most people can't nowadays. So let's just say that first of all. But I just specifically think about this in terms of a lot of like feminist issues that, again, it's like, people want to police each other and be like, well, you should make this choice. It's like, well, you're just adding an additional should on top of them when they're already dealing with a lot of shoulds. So again, just choice is at the core of it for me. And that's, again, not to say you have control over everything, that you get to make things different than they are sometimes, but they're in everything, even things that feel outside, there are always elements of choice. And I just hope to like help people see that, I think.
So I'd like to build on what you're saying,
Yeah, please.
actually, with some sort of personal reflections on shoulds and choices.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's a problem when I often hear therapists say shoulds are a problem. I mean, there's a lot of YouTube videos that are like
Sure. Yeah.
shoulds are a problem,
Yes.
and that's not understanding that every boundary judgment that we make, and we're making thousands of them every day, has a should associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is what we should be including and
Right.
excluding, even if you're not even thinking about it. You're not thinking about it most of the time. So this is what we think. I'm reaching for this glass of water now, and so that's just what I feel like I should be doing at that moment. So should is to me doesn't mean moral
Mm-hmm.
compulsion. Just it's any kind of action we believe ought to be done. Now I want to go back into my childhood again for this,
Please. Yeah.
because I um, so background, and I kind of wanted to mention this at the beginning, but didn't. My father was a German Jewish refugee, and he was the only person from his family to have survived the
Mm-hmm.
Holocaust. And he came over at the age of 15 to the UK. He was smuggled out of Nazi Germany. And aside from his story, which is really interesting, and there's a book by Simon Parkin that's used him as a central
Oh,
character
wow.
to tell the story of the internment of enemy aliens in Britain, and
Mm-hmm.
then what he did. It's The Island of Extraordinary Captives is the book. But leaving that aside, what I grew up with was this sense of needing to have a kind of moral purpose almost.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and when I discovered when we were told about Christianity and God at school, I just dived into it. I mean, to
Mm.
me, as a child who felt lost and afraid, like
Yeah. Right.
I talked about before, which is now I've realized subsequently it's generational trauma, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
um, um, and I was carrying that generational trauma. I mean, you can imagine being at home. Um, my father would he changed his name so he wouldn't be identified as Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the kind of atmosphere. We used to drive through Germany, and he would pretend he didn't speak German, and so that's kind of how I was brought up in that, and that's a lot of what I was carrying. So, when I heard the story uh, of Christ turning the other cheek, oh, did that mean something to me?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was both, to me, it was a justification. I was the smallest, weakest child at school, and in
Mm-hmm.
this kind of fear state. and to not have to hit, not have to fight, was
Yes.
an incredibly powerful message.
Wow. Yeah.
So I absolutely dived into religion. I joined a choir. I spent about 7, 8 years of my childhood going to church 3 times a week and this kind of thing, and eventually actually left that faith behind. I would consider myself an atheist now, but I got so into that. And then you learn at school that there is a the truth you talked about before. We're taught
Yep.
science. We learned that there's a truth. I certainly believed that when I was going into university. And then once I realized just how deep different perspectives go, and I, I suddenly felt completely um, kind of at sea. Like there is no morality because it's all relative to the
Right.
perspective that you're coming from. And then that's what made me have to really rethink things more systemically, because we are agents, systemic agents, we're open systems. There's no essence of us in a sense. We're constructed in relation to everything around us, but nevertheless, we are focal systems ourselves interacting in other systems, which means that those moments of choice are really what we've got to
Right.
to actually be able to exercise some agency and make a difference in the world.
Yes.
So the shoulds are important.
Mm-hmm.
The shoulds are important. We have to ground them in our feelings, because actually that's information that you work with, what you're feeling about the situation. And it for me, I mean, I've talked about this a little bit with Rachel, and I should credit Rachel here, because she really made me understand that actually, by really paying attention to your body when you're in those, that it changes
Yeah. Right. Right.
your whole way of thinking. And I mean, I understood that writing poetry, because my experience of writing poetry is I go inside to write poetry. I'm feeling my body when I'm writing poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that in relation to the mental health work I did, but I hadn't, until about 5 years ago. So working with Rachel kind of really joined that up properly with the systems
Mm-hmm.
thinking work. That's a bit of a detour, but for me, the element of choice is important. But then we need to understand what choice is, um, because for me, anyway, a choice is about enabling ourselves to transcend that one view of should on the one boundary you're seeing, to see multiple possibilities.
Yep.
But when you're seeing those multiple possibilities, and this is again using Rachel's language, you're drawing on the prior understandings that you've developed. So you're drawing on different prior
Mm-hmm.
understandings. You're not saying we're choosing between X and Y that are purely out there, but we're actually choosing things
Mm-hmm.
within ourselves
Mm-hmm.
when we're doing that. We're choosing different ways of perceiving, different ways of understanding, and then acting.
Yes.
That to me is critical, because
Yep.
to me, in a sense, it reconciles. I mean, you can go forever talking about is there free will or not. That's not really where I want to go with this, but it kind of reconciles that dilemma, because seeing things as determined is a narrative you can make if you
Right.
want to
Right.
draw your boundary in that kind of wide way. But once you look at the self as a system, then
Mm-hmm.
actually you begin to see choice like that. And so you have agency within a world that has far more deterministic complexity than you can possibly appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that experience of choice, which is really seeing more in ourselves
Yeah.
and to open up possibilities.
Yeah. For CMM, we talk about bifurcation points. And I think that's where I want to say, like, again, there's like no choice is too small. Like conversationally, for example, you may say something to me and that presents me with a bifurcation point. How do I respond, and what's going to get created based on the turn that I take? And so I, want people to think of choices even in that small, which is not to say
Yeah,
unimportant way. So, Gerald, I
yeah.
truly hate to have to wrap this
Oh,
conversation up, but I have so enjoyed, and I think we probably need a part 2. But what I like to do at the very end is just, again, I hope this whole conversation has felt like a, invitation to explore these ideas. But what else? Is there any last thing you want to leave people with before we end our conversation today?
I want to say something that didn't say earlier, and it seemed quite important.
Sure, please.
But also, I will leave some with something too. If people read my work, there's a lot of stuff where I don't talk about shoulds, I talk about values.
Mm-hmm.
And I've realized that word is problematic, and that's why I've stopped using it. And it's Rachel who pointed me to the problem, and I didn't listen to her for 2 years and I basically started listening out for what
Yes.
she saw as the problem and
Mm.
began to realize that the problem, she said, most people think of values as universal, so they become really hard shoulds.
Yeah.
And that you might, in every one of your talks, she was saying, you relativize that, and you say, no, this is about anything that's important to you in the context of action. But people still don't hear it. They're so
Sure.
used to
Yes.
thinking of values. And I realized, as I heard, really listened to people's questions, that some people got that and some people didn't, and
Great.
it's better to use a different term.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's why, if people who have read my stuff are wondering why I was talking in different terms, that's why.
Mm.
But I guess if the last message I would leave for people thinking about whether they want to embark on the journey of systems thinking and are confronted by the complexity of that, because there are so many different systems approaches. It's, there's loads of different methodologies, loads of different systems, languages,
Mm-hmm.
different
Mm-hmm.
ideas, even what a system is. Um, don't let that complexity uh, stop you,
Yep.
because you can't do anything other than start from where you are. So
Absolutely.
the kinds of skills that I'm talking about, like exploring boundaries, mapping into connections, appreciating different perspectives, seeing emergence, they're things we do every day. It's just we can learn to do them a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
So start from where you are. You can practice those kinds of skills. You can take the next systems idea that might be useful to you
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and start a journey. Don't think of this as, I have to do a degree in systems thinking
Exactly.
in order to be able to start,
Yes.
because that really is not the case.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. It brings us kind of full circle to say that, both of us are offering a should right now. Me saying, you should embody a communication perspective. You saying you should learn systems think. Like, we both believe strongly in those things, and we will remind the listener that they have choice about that, so they can take that and do
Oh,
with it what they
absolutely.
will. So I like
And they're
leaving
not
off there.
necessarily independent. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah, all good things. Thank you for your time and your perspective that you've shared today. I feel like this has been so rich.
Yeah, I've really loved how you've kind of drawn me out.
Thanks,
So
Gerald.
that's really,
Well, I'm
really
grateful
useful.
for what you've chosen to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. You can email questions, reflections, ideas, and stories to storieslived.storiestolд@gmail.com for a chance to be featured in an episode. You can comment on our Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, or the CMM Institute YouTube page to engage with other listeners. And you can subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to make sure you're getting every episode right in your inbox. Links to all these places can be found in the show notes for this episode. Other ways you can support this podcast are by following, rating, and reviewing the show wherever you listen. Plus, please share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, an organization dedicated to furthering the coordinated management of meaning theory and practice of communication. More information about CMM can be found at cmminstitute.substack.com. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.